Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. Last time, we got to know Ramses II, the long-lived and probably self-obsessed pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty. Today, we will be moving forward in time by a few centuries and shifting back to that fun spot where we started, Mesopotamia, where we will meet the Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II. A lot has happened in the area, which you will recall is also referred to as the Near East, since we last stopped by for a visit. Way back in the beginning of this series, we met Sargon the Great, and with him the rise and fall of the Akkadians. I dropped some ominous foreshadowing about the coming rise of other regional powers like the Amorites and Elamites. In the Thutmose III and Ramses II episodes, we met the Mitanni, then the Hittites, expansionist empires hell-bent on going toe-to-toe with Egypt. These are just a few of the developments affecting this always complex region, from the first episode, across the last few, to this one. But there's really no way to catch up on everything that's been going on in the Near East since we last said goodbye to Sargon. I kind of miss him though, do you? And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, be sure to go back and listen to episode 1. The ups and downs, rise and collapses of kingdoms, tribes, powers, alliances, etc. is too complicated a knot to untangle right now. So, if you are an ardent Near East scholar, then please accept my apologies. We are only going to fill in a few blanks to help set the stage for Nebuchadnezzar the Great. Now, just a moment ago I mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Neo, as you know, means new. So does this mean there was an old Babylonian Empire? Well, yes. Yes, it does. Babylon is an ancient city. Even by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it was already an ancient city, nearly 1,700 years old. Early in its history, there was little to indicate the prominent role it would take as the seat of empires. The first appearance of the city in the historical record came during the relatively brief time of the Akkadian Empire, forged by our friend Sargon. A center of commerce and religion, Babylon was just another of the myriad city-states that dotted the plains around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As time progressed, the city slowly grew richer and more powerful. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed, various kings and tribes would take their turn at trying to build up their own kingdoms in the area, and Babylon fell under the sway of this group or that over the centuries, generally subject to other geopolitical powers, offering no real hint that it would blossom into the seat of an empire. But it was prosperous, enjoyed a strategically advantageous location on the banks of the Euphrates, and it just kept growing. The destiny of the city took a dramatic turn when yet another conqueror put in plans his motions for regional supremacy in the 18th century BCE. The famous king Hammurabi was not the first king of his tribe, the Amorites, but he was certainly the most ambitious. All the way back when they ran the show under Sargon and friends, the Akkadians had seen the Amorites as barbarous, uncouth nomads. These Amorites were Semitic-speaking people from the northern Levant, living on the periphery of Acadia. Akkadians and Sumerians looked down their noses at the Amorites, who they saw as rural and uncultured barbarians living on the fringes of the civilized world. But when the Akkadian Empire was beset with drought and their society collapsed in the 2100s BCE, it was the Amorites that eventually stepped into the power vacuum and began asserting themselves across the lands of the former Akkadian Empire. Look at me. I'm the captain now. But rather than immediately replace one empire with the other, the process of fully consolidating the region into a successor polity following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. It was Hammurabi, that famous lawgiver, who changed everything. The Amorites had been haphazardly throwing their weight around for about a century by the time Hammurabi rose to power in 1792 BCE. But they had mostly been scuffling about, not substantively growing their power base or conquering or subjugating cities far and wide, in the manner of the Sumerians under Lugal-Zaggisi or the Akkadians under Sargon. That didn't mean that Hammurabi's predecessors hadn't been aggressive or militaristic. On the contrary, the 5 Amorite kings that preceded him were just as ambitious as any good ascendant Near East player. They'd had some successes building their own nascent empire, but until their most famous king, there was little to indicate that the Amorites would soon stand head and shoulders above the other cultures of the time. When he became king, Hammurabi enacted big plans, and he deployed his considerable organizational skill to the project of extending Amorite power. Building up his own army, he took his show on the road and began a series of conquests that would eventually build on the foundational work done by his predecessors and result in a true successor state to the Akkadians. With this force, Hammurabi smacked around the other players in the area, the Assyrians and the Elamites, for example. He also turned his energies to conquering other local kingdoms that had been built by related tribes of Amorites. Common culture be damned. He was hell-bent on expanding his territory. By vanquishing these rival kingdoms, he was able to increase the territory under his sway and consolidate his power. Campaign after campaign, he built what we now call the Old Babylonian Kingdom. And why do we call it that? Well, Hammurabi's project needed a headquarters, and he understood the strategic importance of that promising city, Babylon. His predecessors had conquered the city, but Hammurabi went a step further, making Babylon his capital. Once set up in the burgeoning city, Hammurabi took a page from Sargon's playbook. Rather than forcibly introduce Amorite religion and customs, the king instead embraced Babylonian traditions, including adopting and promulgating the worship of its local deities. Babylon had grown into a center of culture and learning. It was from this capital that he issued his famous law code, the Code of Hammurabi, which, among other things, gave some legal protections to women and children and slaves, as well as solving property disputes and settling punishments for a number of infractions. The Code of Hammurabi is seen as a landmark innovation, especially given the protections it afforded to a wide range of people and property. It certainly was an important advancement, but it's worth noting that the Code of Hammurabi is based on earlier Sumerian and Akkadian legal traditions. It's even written in Akkadian, so once again, thank you, Sargon. Despite his reputation for justice, Hammurabi could be merciless when dealing with his enemies or upstarts. In one case, he formed an alliance with a neighboring king, and when his new ally let his guard down, Hammurabi betrayed his new friend, sent in his army, killed the king and his court, tore down his palaces, desecrated his temples, and slaughtered the local populace. In short, don't let the Code of Hammurabi fool you. He was similar to a lot of rulers of his age, and this penchant for violence sowed the seeds of discontent that often followed such brutal oppression and subjugation. And yet, even as his armies fanned out across the region, they brought with them the culture and refinements of the Babylonian Empire. A byproduct of Hammurabi's militarism was thus the spreading of Babylonian culture. It is for this introduction of advanced civilization for which Hammurabi is remembered and celebrated, even despite his penchant for brutality. I suppose Hammurabi would have been disappointed to know that the Babylonian Empire that he built would not long outlive him. After Hammurabi died in approximately 1750 BCE, the old Babylonian Empire eroded quickly, shrinking into Babylon itself. In 1595 BCE, the city was ransacked by the burgeoning Hittites, the same people that were so problematic to our old friend Ramses II. When Babylon fell, so too did the Amorite era. The Hittites were a force to be reckoned with, but an even more ominous shadow loomed on the horizon. Now we're going to leave Babylon here for a moment, a city that rose and fell in prominence, and along the way had enjoyed its position as the center of a great empire, and with it, the status of a center of culture, law, commerce, learning, and religion. Even after the Hittite sack and the destruction of the old Babylonian Empire, the great city on the Euphrates would get another shot at glory. Before we meet our great for today, we need to do one more introduction of another of the countless ancient cultures and empires of the Near East, the Assyrians, or more precisely, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Just like the Babylonians, the Assyrians would rise, fall, and rise again. But people and empire marked as Assyrian stretch back before 2000 BCE. The history of Assyria is long and complicated, no less so than any contemporary civilization. In a way not all too dissimilar from the Egyptians, the Assyrians were around for so long and had so many twists and turns in their history that their chronology is likewise divided up into several distinct periods: the early Assyrian period, the old Assyrian period, the middle Assyrian period, and finally, what matters for us today, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was established with the rise of King Adad-nirari II in 911 BCE. For our purposes, this kingdom is important for three reasons. 1. They were the dominant power of the Near East at the time. 2. Their territory included Babylon. And 3. Because these were the guys that the resurgent Babylonians would eventually square off against, not only fighting for their liberation, but eventually aiming to knock the Assyrians off the throne as the big bad wolf. That said, this is not a history of the Assyrians, so this is a quick summary. The Assyrian Empire began its aggressive expansion in the Near East in about the mid-1900s BCE. Following this, and as mentioned, Assyria had waxed and waned as a power over the centuries. With the advent of the Neo-Assyrian period in the 10th century BCE, this new empire was distinctly different in how it did business. This was not your father's Assyrian Empire. These guys meant business. They swelled the ranks of their armies by requiring every single male to serve, the first nation to make military service universally compulsory. They trained relentlessly and ingrained an ethic of vicious conquest in all their soldiers. This was more than run-of-the-mill conscription. It was wholesale cultural programming of a warrior class. The soldiers served in 3-year cycles. Year 1 was physical labor, by which new conscripts would build bridges, roads, and other infrastructure. Year 2 was when troops were sent off to go fighting in their endless wars. Year 3 was time for family to tend to farm and crops, and importantly, sire or raise the next generation of Assyrian conquerors. Then it all started over again. Build, conquer, procreate, repeat, year after year. The ranks of their army swelled, each troop inculcated with the fervor of Assyrian supremacy. From their capital of Ashur, on the west bank of the Tigris River in what is today Iraq, the Neo-Assyrians began to push out in all directions. As the 900s BCE gave way to the 800s, their aggressive expansion led to complete control of northern Mesopotamia, and they shifted their capital city to Nimrud. Tiglath-Pileser III, ruled circa 744 to 727 BCE, took over the throne, possibly in a palace coup, after a period of stagnation and instability. Equal parts pragmatic reformer and militaristic expansionist, Tiglath-Pileser overhauled the Assyrian system and led campaigns and conquered territory across the Near East, into Anatolia, to the Mediterranean, into Armenia, and a sizable chunk of modern Israel. In his 17 years on the throne, the Assyrians doubled the size of their empire. For our story, he is important because in the last year of his reign, 727 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Babylon and added it to the Assyrian domains. For our story, he is important because in the last year of his reign, 727 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Babylon and added it to the Assyrian dominions. Let's take a second and consider what these Assyrian conquests meant for the people being conquered. Even in an age when slaughter and pillage were common, the Assyrians were brutal. They took great pains to make sure that anyone that stood in their way suffered, and they seemed to invent all sorts of insidious forms to humiliate and torture their vanquished foes. Some of the plays in their sadistic playbook included hacking off the arms and gouging out the eyes of victims, then letting the poor wretches wander around to be a sort of wandering billboard to advertise the fate of anyone who resisted. They flayed prisoners alive and hung their skins from city walls. They impaled enemies on large stakes, often in huge numbers. The Assyrians, it would seem, even invented crucifixion. I want this to be a reasonably family-friendly show, and this is getting a bit gruesome, but needless to say, add to these horrors many more besides, some of which make us gasp for their sheer brutality. Belligerent cities weren't just conquered, they were obliterated, the population slaughtered, the buildings razed. These and countless other methods of torture, execution, and psychological terror struck fear in the hearts of enemies. Some local populations were rounded up en masse and forcibly resettled on the far side of the empire, so as to prevent their ability to rebel in the future. Foreshadowing alert. This is a technique of suppression that we will revisit down the road. We know this in large part because, well, they bragged about it. Far from being ashamed of their atrocities, Assyrian cities and palaces are adorned with engravings of graphic depictions of the torture, dismemberment, and slaughter of enemies. They celebrated the horrors they inflicted on others. Rulers grounded their legitimacy in these horrors. They tried to one-up one another and invent new cruelties. Such cheerful folks. Before a confrontation would begin, the Assyrians would offer their adversary the chance to surrender. Do so, and they would live. Resist and, well, suffer the consequences. Some cities, not wishing to even have to confront the choice with an Assyrian army at their gates, proactively sent word that they would submit, loading down envoys with gifts of tribute and orders to humiliate themselves in supplication. Loss of dignity? Maybe. Pragmatic step to ensure the preservation of life and limbs and eyeballs? Definitely. Sometimes, all the Assyrians needed to do to conquer a foreign city was simply answer the knock on their own front door and accept the gifts that panicked dignitaries from far-off cities had hurried to their Assyrian overlords. Their reputation preceded them wherever they went. The Assyrians reached their zenith in the reign of Sargon II, who took his regnal name to honor the illustrious Sargon the Great, our old friend who kicked off the series. Go back and listen. Okay, now I'm really done. This Assyrian Sargon ruled circa 721 to 705 BCE. He founded a new royal dynasty and pushed the Assyrian Empire to its greatest extent. Assyria became the world's first superpower, the one nation feared by all others. Sargon II was an effective ruler, one of the strongest and most accomplished of all of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Every once in a while, some cities or kingdoms might have attempted to stand up to the vicious bully, but everyone, positively everyone, lived in fear of Assyrian brutality. Like his contemporaries, Sargon II was merciless in crushing his enemies. In one case, he went all Kaiser Soze. When someone resisted, he took it extremely personal. He didn't just destroy an enemy kingdom in battle. He razed and pillaged all their towns, destroyed all their agricultural fields, cut down and burned all their forests. Anyone left alive was enslaved. A future chronicler would say of the Romans that they made a desert and called it a peace. The Romans were surely not the first to deploy total war. By submission or by conquest, the Assyrians became the dominant force of the Near East, but people tend to resent violent oppressors, and Sargon spent considerable energy putting down rebellions or trying to. Later in his reign, Babylonians rose up in revolt, forming an alliance with the Elamites. We met them earlier in the Sargon episode. They ousted the Assyrian governor and put their own people on the Babylonian throne. Sargon II, our Assyrian friend, fought to regain control of the city, but it would take him years to dislodge the rebel leaders. Babylon emerged as a thorn in his side, a rare vulnerability for the otherwise gruesomely powerful Assyrian king. Sargon II died in 705 BCE, likely while in the middle of attempting to oppress a rebellion. His successors carried out his legacy of conquest, invading every town and kingdom that they set their eyes on. They weren't always victorious. For example, their siege of Jerusalem failed, but they were always destructive. From a timeline standpoint, we're now just a few decades before our great for this episode, Nebuchadnezzar, will enter the stage. At this time, the Assyrians sought to quash all rebellions, reminding everyone who was in charge and prove how dumb it was to resist. But the fates of empires rise and fall. Horrific though their methods may have been, the post-Sargon II Assyrian Empire hit some turbulence, including internal power struggles and external rebellion from some pesky cities. Things looked a little shaky. As they had in various times throughout their history, the Assyrians came surging back again, subduing any revolts and shoring up the foundations of their empire. This they did with their characteristic ruthless efficiency. But why just stop there? Once they settled their own affairs, the Assyrians decided to renew their expansionist conquest, and what great kingdom would be complete without the crown jewel of Egypt? The Assyrians sent wave after wave against the Egyptians, occasionally seizing and sacking key cities and driving the pharaohs from Lower Egypt. Conquering Egypt was an obsession for the Assyrians. They just kept coming and coming. They were relentless. Egypt had been through some things since we last checked in on them. For once, they'll have to be the ones to suffer gross oversimplification, as it's all too complex, and not really relevant to the story of Nebuchadnezzar for us to dive deep here. And we will get back into Egypt in the next episode or so we will just state that in this time, Egypt was under the control of the 25th dynasty, a series of pharaohs from Cush. This came to pass when sometime around 744 BCE, the Kushite kingdom decided to flip the script, and they invaded Egypt. They conquered their longtime rivals, grabbing control of the kingdom and installing themselves as pharaohs. These Kushites were the pharaohs trying to stem the tide of Assyrian onslaught. In this, they were not successful. Assyria did their Assyrian thing and slaughtered this and sacked that and, just generally lived up to their reputation. They're the worst in the world. But, due in part by their decades-long project of conquering Egypt, Assyria showed signs of fatigue. They had invested considerable resources in this project, spreading themselves quite thin in the process. They installed some puppet kings and left town to go fight the brush fires popping up all over their empire. Bear with me, because these puppet kings are important, and we're almost there. Promise. One such brush fire the Assyrians needed to put out was the troublesome Babylonians, who had some big ideas about throwing off the Assyrian yoke. The Babylonians began looking over at their reeling neighbors, and rather than feeling fear and terror, they saw opportunity. With all the energy Assyria was spending on Egypt, perhaps they'd let themselves be a bit vulnerable. One guy in particular, in Babylon, realized that the time was right to cause a little bit of trouble for the Assyrians. But the catch was, this particular troublemaker, scheming to liberate Babylon, wasn't exactly Babylonian. He was Chaldean. If you heard that and thought, oh no, here comes another tangent, don't panic. We're introducing a member of a tribe who is very important to our story. And all we need to know about the Chaldeans is that they were a hardy tribe who migrated into Mesopotamia sometime around 1000 BCE. just before Adad-nirari II established the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For generations, they lived in swampy lands or hardscrabble, arid lands of minimal agricultural productivity. They were tough, hardy people, used to living on the margins. So our troublemaker, Nabopolassar, was born sometime around 658 BCE. Little is known definitively of his origins, but in addition to being one of those hardscrabble, tough Chaldeans, he was ambitious, shrewd, and bold. When the powerful Assyrian king Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, internal chaos roiled an already teetering empire. Nabopolassar saw his opportunity, and he made his move. In 626 BCE, he declared himself king of Babylon and occupied the city. It was this act that historians mark as the founding of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, about 3 centuries after the establishment of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Incidentally, when he moved into his new digs, he brought along his precocious young son, who was born sometime in 630 BCE. In control of a powerful city, and with a precious son and heir in tow, things were looking up for the ambitious king. With Babylon as his power base, and with Assyria roiled by internal instability, Nabopolassar rose in active revolt against his overlords, bent on driving them out of Babylonia. Despite their internal issues, Assyria wasn't prepared to let such a large and profitable part of their empire go without a fight. A bloody struggle ensued. Each side scored victories and suffered setbacks. Given the Assyrians' track record of brutality and oppression, Nabopolassar was leading more than a revolt. It was an existential threat to the life and well-being of every one of his subjects. Win, and they would be free of Assyrian overlordship. Lose, and, well, we all know what happens to those who dare defy Assyria. It took nearly 10 years, but slowly and surely, Nabopolassar drove the Assyrians out of Babylonia. He'd started his project seeking to be king of Babylon, but given his successful revolt, he now commanded considerable territory. He had to shift focus to think of how to defend this new kingdom. After all, Assyria could regroup and reinvade from the north. As the more than 1,000 years of Assyrian history could attest, these people had a penchant for regrouping and coming back stronger and more horrifyingly brutal than ever. To increase his chances of success with this project, Nabopolassar struck upon a diplomatic plan. He bolstered his position by forging an alliance with another warrior tribe, the Medes. The Medes, by the way, are another powerful and important people from Near Eastern history, but we're going to mostly skip over them right now, but know that they loom very large in episodes to come. Please know they're important, and like the Babylonians, they were sick and tired of the horror show that was Assyria. With the Assyrians being beset by power struggles and civil war, they didn't have the ability to curb the upstart Babylonian king, either militaristically or diplomatically. Nabopolassar had successfully reconquered the key city-states of the region, and his kingdom stretched outward from Babylon as the Assyrian Empire collapsed in on itself. By 1616 BCE, Nabopolassar had consolidated the cities of Babylonia into an integrated unit. Again, at first, his goal had been simply to run the Assyrians out of Babylonia and shore up his borders. This took 10 years, but he'd accomplished the goal completely. He had been so successful, in fact, that he had asked himself why stop there. After all, the Assyrians, for all their attempts to brutalize and intimidate everyone, were now just a paper tiger, their reputation far exceeding their actual current strength. Why not take the fight to them? Surely, there are plenty of people that would be thrilled to see those vicious guys get their comeuppance. Kick them while they're down. Do not give them a chance to regroup. This was certainly the position of Nabopolassar's allies, the Medes. This tribe, who I already promised will get more attention in the episode to come, had been growing in power for a couple of centuries, expanding from their mountainous territory in what is today northern Iran, and realizing that, like the Chaldean Babylonians, it was time to overthrow the oppressive Assyrians. Given their shared antipathy for the Assyrians, the Babylonians and Medes made natural allies. Together, they resolved to destroy the Assyrians, ending their century-long reign of terror and to end any Assyrian claims over their respective territories. The onslaught was swift and brutal. In 614 BCE, the Medes invaded Assyria and thoroughly sacked the spiritual and administrative center of the kingdom, the city of Ashur, from which Assyria is derived. In 612 BCE, Nabopolassar and the Medes linked up to conquer the great city of Nineveh. In this conquest, Nabopolassar got an up-close and personal look at the methods of his Median allies. Perhaps venting their fury at the savagery of the Assyrians, the Medes likewise unleashed a torrent of destruction, torture, and brutality that made Nabopolassar look sideways at his bloodthirsty ally. In sacking these key Assyrian cities, the Medes were a little too quick to deploy the very same methods that had made the Assyrians themselves so reviled. The Medes, allies though they may have been, may not have been much better than the kingdom they helped displace. In addition to the men fighting in the armies, the Medes slaughtered women, children, and the elderly en masse. Priests were tortured and killed and temples desecrated. This was above and beyond in the ancient world. Well, aside from Assyria. Consider how many conquerors adopted local deities of the cities they took. Dominating a city and appropriating its gods was a way for a leader to build their strength. If I rule your city, then your gods must favor me more than they favor you. My gods plus your gods is a lot more power, both on earth and in the heavens. Destroying the temples of a vanquished foe was kind of a big middle finger. The savagery of the Medes shocked the Babylonians. Just with whom had they allied themselves? The sackings of Ashur, Nineveh, and all the key cities of Assyria left the once mighty empire teetering. But like all great empires of this time period, there is nothing to suggest that fortunes couldn't rise again. They were wounded, but they weren't done yet. The best thing the Assyrians had going for them was their relationship with Egypt's 26th dynasty, the group of puppet kings Assyria had installed following their conquest of that great and ancient kingdom. And as we've seen before, even a diminished Egypt still had tremendous resources at their disposal. Egypt and Assyria teamed up to make a last stand, but Egypt was far away. Correspondence took a long time to go back and forth. Assyria would have to hang on until their allies could enter the theater of war. Widening the aperture a little bit reveals a fascinating dynamic unfolding as this conflict amped up. Part of what makes this time period so interesting is the sheer number of different tribes and kingdoms involved in these conflicts. We've mentioned the Cushites, Egypt, Assyria, the Medes, and the Neo-Babylonians and their Chaldean king. This doesn't even touch on some of the other nations and people we haven't really brought into the picture, such as the Scythians, the Lydians, the Aramaeans, the Cimmerians. As we will see in a second, the kingdom of Judah, the forerunner of modern Israel, also had a role to play. Neutrality was not really an option. Each of these nations and peoples had to pick a side. So while the headliners were the Babylonians, Medes, Assyrians, and Egyptians, this conflict didn't just pit one power against another. These were multinational and multi-ethnic coalitions slugging it out. The geopolitical complexity is quite remarkable. I wouldn't go so far as to say this was one of the first world wars, but it wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that the intricate international relationships that led to such conflicts definitely were not a 20th century invention. We will keep our focus on the main players as we bring Nebuchadnezzar into the light, but know that this is a roiling war that engulfed the entire region. By the time that this ultimate showdown with the Assyrians was reaching its apogee, Nabopolassar was a seasoned, battle-tested leader. His armies had fought vicious enemies in existential life-or-death struggles, and he had always come out on top. He had driven a feared and loathed foreign ruler from his territory, established a new kingdom, and planted the seeds of his own empire. Adding to this, he managed to form and maintain an alliance with a very aggressive neighbor in the Medes, and to keep them on the same side of the table. Finding and building common cause with this group was no easy task. In the alliance's great project of overthrowing Assyrian overlordship, so much of their success can be traced to his steely determination and tactical genius. He was patient, focused on his long-term goals, and methodical in his pursuit of them. His resume was so impressive. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that the next generation was going to outshine him, Nabopolassar would likely go down in history as one of the all-time greats. Like many kings and queens we've discussed in this series, Nabopolassar understood that no legacy would amount to much in the long run without a well-prepared successor to protect and build upon his accomplishments. Given the importance of religious life in the Babylonian society, Nabopolassar introduced his crown prince to the people by appointing him to be the high priest at the temple and the family stronghold of Uruk, even while still just a teenager. While this was a good start, the king shrewdly estimated that the best way to train his son and successor was to put him in the army. After all, Babylonia had been liberated, and the kingdom had been established only through a decade of warfare. To understand how to rule, his son needed to know how to fight. Just like Thutmose III, our old friend from a few episodes back, the military life was a perfect fit for the prince, who demonstrated the same positive characteristics that marked Nabopolassar out as a uniquely capable leader. It was sometime during the course of the Assyrian campaign that Nebuchadnezzar more fully enters the picture. In addition to his highly accomplished father, he seems to have had at least one uncle among the upper ranks of the Babylonian military structure to aid his apprenticeship. Bursting with natural talent and energy, before long, his combination of talent and familial relations vaulted him to the top of the Babylonian command structure. Nebuchadnezzar assumed the role of commander-in-chief of the Babylonians, reporting directly to the king, or as Nebuchadnezzar called him, Dad. By 609 BCE, the sprawling super-regional conflict that engulfed the Near East had brought the Assyrians to their knees. They made a last stand at their capital city of Haran, but, once again, the coalition forces led by the father-son duo of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar prevailed. The fall of Haran was the death knell for Assyria. The once mighty, dreaded, loathed, and feared empire was dead, never to be revived. Historians solemnly note 609 BCE as the final year for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Gone, but not forgotten, and certainly not to be missed, at least by their foes. But that's one of the funny things about history. With the benefit of hindsight, these lines seem so clean and tidy. But for those living through the events, the picture was decidedly more blurry. For, after Haran fell, there may not have been an Assyrian empire, but there were a lot of Assyrian troops floating around, and they weren't done fighting just yet. And it's not like the Assyrians were trained to back down. As long as there was one soldier left standing, there was a battle to be had. It was just a flesh wound. Their troops were fanatical, trained from the earliest ages to believe in their invincibility. This remnant army just needed a little help, and help was on the way. In fact, there was an army marching to their relief. Back in Egypt, Pharaoh Necho II frantically organized an expedition to join up with their Assyrian allies to hopefully stem the tide of the surging Babylonian and Median coalition. Marching north, they entered the kingdom of Judah. The Judeans did not want the meddlesome Egyptians on their turf, and they sent an army personally led by their king, Josiah, to oppose the crossing of their territory. Outside of Megiddo, remember Megiddo from the Tutmosis III episode? It's back! The Egyptians crushed the Judeans. Josiah was killed, and Judah once again became a vassal state of Egypt. Not to get too far afield, but in the Ramses II episode, I said that some scholars have cast doubt that the events depicted in the biblical book of Exodus date from his reign. It is following this period, with Egypt once again ruling over Judah and captives having been taken back to Egypt, that some believe the stories of Exodus originate. Back to the story. The Egyptian army bested and killed King Josiah, reasserted control over Judah, and went on the march to link up with their Assyrian allies. In 605 BCE, bolstered by these new arrivals, the forces came together near the Syrian city of Carchemish on the banks of the Euphrates. All of a sudden, the seemingly vanquished Assyrians were threatening to make a serious comeback. By this time, Nebuchadnezzar had gotten another promotion. Not only was he in charge of the Babylonian army, but he also appears to have been commanding the entire coalition forces, Babylonians, Medes, and all their affiliated nations. This by itself is quite remarkable. Most nations at this time marched into battle under the banner of their kings or commanders. For a people as powerful and domineering as the Medes, to take orders from a Babylonian reflects the level of respect that Nebuchadnezzar commanded and the trust placed in him by his allies. Nebuchadnezzar was also a shrewd tactician. Remember, Babylon had been under Assyrian control for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar had grown up in a world shaped by Assyrian brutality. The prince had been engaged in a vicious struggle with the Assyrians for a while now. He'd had an up-close look at how Assyrian tactics and command structure work. He had a grasp of how they conducted themselves on the field of battle. He knew how they thought. When considering his battle plan, he was armed with more than weapons. He had knowledge, too. The Assyrians were a wounded tiger, but they were desperate to make a stand. Had the might of the Egyptians, and the contest was no cakewalk for Nebuchadnezzar or the coalition forces he led. As so often seems to be the case, there was a lot on the line as the showdown loomed. If the Egyptian-Assyrian coalition won the day, then they could reverse the tide, reclaim the upper hand, and deploy their customary brutality to slaughter the haughty upstarts. If the Median-Babylonian alliance could prevail, then the dreaded Assyrians would finally be vanquished once and for all, much to the relief of pretty much everyone. The two forces marched toward one another, the fate of the known world hanging in the balance. As they closed with one another, they prepared for battle, and just when they were within striking distance of one another, they each did nothing. The two armies made camp on opposite banks of the Euphrates, each sizing each other up, no one making a move, each waiting on the other to act. Nebuchadnezzar judged that the speed and shock were his greatest assets. But how to surprise an enemy when they are staring at you from across a river? He judged that a little patience could do the trick. He gave the Assyrian and Egyptian army the impression that he had settled into a nice camp routine, content to dig in. He made no signs of preparing for battle. They stoked the campfires, set up their encampment. Army had a half day. This torpor was an act. Nebuchadnezzar was waiting for the moment that his enemies let their guard down, even just for a second. That moment came soon enough. Just when all seemed to have fallen into a lull, he launched a surprise assault west across the Euphrates River and caught his enemy off guard. At first, the plan worked to perfection. With the element of surprise, the Babylonian-led coalition had all the initial momentum. But once it wore off, the Egyptian-Assyrian forces regrouped, and long accustomed to the fog of war, they began to regain their footing. These combined forces seemed to have been under the overall command of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. The battle began to even out. For some time, the outcome hung in the balance. With each side barely evenly matched, the next phase of the Battle of Carchemish was vicious and bloody. These armies slugged it out. Inexorably, with the generalship of Nebuchadnezzar and fueled by their hatred of the Assyrians, the Babylonian-led coalition forces took the upper hand. They slowly built their own momentum, and once established, the tide of battle shifted definitively in favor of the Median Babylonians. They drove the enemy from the field in a panicked retreat. The last vestiges of the Egyptian-Assyrian army made a desperate break to find refuge behind the walls of any city they could reach. They were in a race for survival, and they needed speed. They threw down their weapons and their armor, and they fled. This rout was a final humiliation for an empire that had inflicted so much terror, so many horrors, on so many people over such a long time. Nebuchadnezzar and his forces were not going to let a single enemy troop reach safe harbors. They relentlessly pursued the shattered army of their adversary, caught up to and slaughtered every last soldier. Assyria was dead, and so too were all of its soldiers. No more comebacks, no more terrorizing conquered peoples, no more celebrations of their own imaginative brutality. No more Assyria. Before we close this dreaded chapter of history, one last word on the Assyrians. For all their power, all their brutality, when the end came, it came fast. The collapse of their empire might have been facilitated by internal struggles, but the speed with which Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, and their Median allies accomplished this conquest was remarkable. Woe to tyrants, I suppose. For his part, the pharaoh Necho II limped back to Egypt to lick his wounds. Not to skip too far ahead, but Egypt's in for some serious trouble, either in a few decades or the next grade of history covered in this podcast, depending on your preferred method of keeping time. Either way, the Battle of Carchemish not only marked the end of Assyria, but also the end of Egyptian intervention in the Near East. It also cemented Nebuchadnezzar as a brilliant leader in his own right, no longer in Nabopolassar's shadow. The Battle of Carchemish ended the imperial pretensions of not one, but two great ancient superpowers in the span of one battle. Assyria was dead, and Egypt was on life support. Nebuchadnezzar had arrived. It was his time. Speaking of time, this brings us to our pause in the story for this episode. Don't be disappointed. Think of how much ground we've covered. We saw the rise of both Babylonians and the Medes, the death of Assyria, and the entrance on the stage of Nebuchadnezzar the Great. Thank you again for listening to this episode. I'm grateful that you did. Join us the next time when we take a long look at just what Nebuchadnezzar did when it was his time in charge, and how the great king built the greatest city the world has ever known.